Trouvelot and his son ran into these guys, and they knew each other, of course, from the days in Washington. They invited Trouvelot and his son to join them. And they set up camp in the middle of the plains, and a little dugout is where he set up his telescope. And they observed this eclipse. And this is what he said about the eclipse. As the moon blotted out the sun, he noted, quote, the color of the corona, and indeed the whole part of the sky, appeared of a pale ashy gray, delicately tinted with a shade of sea green color, end quote. With some ambivalence at this time of Trouvelot's life, and we don't know exactly why, he chose to return to France. He still had a fascination with solar astronomy, but he returned to France in 1882, and he joined a scientist, a well-known astronomer of the sun, a man named Jules Janssen. He was director of the Meudon Observatory in France, and there he could indulge his passion with this love for eclipses. One of the first things he did was to accompany Janssen and a team. Well, I should show he was very interested in solar protuberances is what he called them, and you can see the beautiful color here. This was observed much earlier than the eclipse that we mentioned of 1878, but you can see he had to use a little imagination here, but you can see, those of you who are familiar with this type of phenomena, you can see how accurate they look. But anyway, he went to oh, thank you. They went to this little island, Caroline Island in the South Pacific, to observe a solar eclipse in search for the elusive Vulcan, which was a planet that people felt was somewhere within the orbit of Mercury and the Sun. Of course, no such thing exists, but they felt while they were doing it anyway, they might as well look for Vulcan. They didn't find Vulcan. There and back in France at Meudon Observatory, he examined and drew solar prominences, like I just showed you previously, but the very poor seeing conditions in Europe curtailed his observing, and there he starts to write about his depression. He goes into a serious depression, and when he goes back to France. He wrote his old friend Edward Holden, then who was University of California president at the time. He wrote of his gloominess in thinking of the purity of the American sky. By this time he was also in poor health, and he expressed the desire not only to escape the cold dampness of Europe, but to return to America, quote, to breathe again the air of the free. I think he was probably obviously talking about the political situation, but I think the seeing conditions in the skies were also playing on his mind. But he never came back to America, where really he spent the most stimulating years of his life. He died at Meudon, France on the 22nd of April of 1895. He left behind a controversial flirtation with entomology, over 50 papers in astronomy, a lunar crater on the moon named in his honor, and hundreds of the most exquisite illustrations of celestial phenomena ever recorded. But he also left behind the scourge of the gypsy moth. And I know I will never forget him for that. There's a close-up of that scene, the previous scene.
Ooh, which one is him? Far right.
Right there. Looks a little older in that scene than the first picture we saw of him. Now, ironically, a large photographic copy of the Great Comet of 1882 that he produced hangs in my mountain cabin in West Virginia. I've often shaken my fist at that illustration, even as the gypsy moths have consumed my beloved oaks just outside. You will all be pleased to know that I have been chairman of the Spring Gap Mountain Property Owners Association Gypsy Moth Eradication Committee for the past 20 years. Merci, Monsieur Trouvelot.
voice left to answer me?
I have a voice, a little bit of a voice left. So anyone have any questions I might answer about this wonderful scientist? Yes, sir.
Do you still have creosote?
We use, actually, it's interesting. We use a substance called dimolin, which is environmentally friendly as you can get, and we use aircraft. We had, believe it or not, a C-47, a DC-3, 2 years ago, came over, and they do this maybe every 5 years or so. It's the only way they can keep them under control. It turns out that after 3 defoliations, after 2 successive defoliations, you will get about a 30% death rate in the trees, in oak trees. It weakens them to such a degree that they can't survive. Yes, sir.
How much anger did he hear about this era of the bugs?
Very little in his lifetime. It wasn't really until 1890 that they had completely traversed the Commonwealth of Massachusetts from the east end to the west end. And even today, we have the problem all the way south as far as the Carolinas now. They're into South Carolina. And you know, with the way people move around today, these gypsy moth caterpillars, what happens, the egg masses adhere to the bottom of motorhomes, you know, anything that moves. And certainly under structures. You see them under stones, under rocks. You find them everywhere. If you want to have a little fun, you get your kid with a blowtorch and you tell them to find them on rocks, and when you start putting the heat to them, they pop like popcorn. You got to get your joy where you get it, you know? Yes.
Was Trouvelot the only one experimenting with these moths?
As far as we know, he's the only one who was experimenting with the gypsy moth caterpillars, yes. By the way, they didn't produce a high-quality silk. You know, that's the tragedy.
Yeah.
He had these polyphemus ones, which were native, that were producing an excellent silk, but he wasn't happy with it. He had to go to France and bring these creatures back. And they don't produce a high-quality silk. So all that effort for what? I don't know. Yes, sir.
Do you know if his house survives in Medford now?
I think that house on Myrtle Street is no longer there, I understand.
Was eaten by moths.
Yeah, the moths ate it, yeah. No, I have to tell you, no, really, it's an emotionally charged issue with a lot of people who love trees. We've had people up on our mountain in West Virginia. As I say, I'm the coordinator for the committee. I'm the one who signs the contract with the state of West Virginia Department of Agriculture to come and spray these things, to spray the forest. And what happens with this material called dimolin, they eat the leaves, and then what it does, they try to eat the leaves, they eat maybe a little bit of the leaves, they get the stuff in their system, and they can't molt to the next stage.
Aww.
They become very hard, the cocoon becomes hard, and they literally explode. Oh, I love the sound of exploding caterpillars. It's a great sound.
Fecal matter dropping from the trees.
Yeah, great. It's a great sound. But it's a very emotional issue, because if you've ever been in a place, especially if you have a tin roof, and you hear this stuff going on, and you see a totally denuded forest, and you love these trees, as I do, you get really emotional about it, and you want to go to France, you want to tip over his headstone at very least. Yes, sir.
I've got a couple comments and anecdotes. One is that, as far as I understand, when Trouvelot made these terrific drawings of the solar prominences, often he was using a solar spectroscope. It's very similar to the one that's on display here, the Browning, at Seagrave Observatory, to see the prominences outside of eclipses. A tough technique, but I think he was doing that, and it's very interesting. Another comment. Oh goodness, I tried to order them all in my mind. Well, the anecdote. That's the only big chromolithograph I've got, but I've got quite a few smaller ones, because it was Norm Sperling here at Astro Assembly going back 20, 25